Okay, so we got an exciting lecture today. Why did you go into psychology versus, some other field, building bridges, something like that? So, the one of the reasons why I got interested in psychology and neuroscience was, what is it about humans that gives them so much more cognitive power compared to other animals, despite the fact that we basically have exactly the same kind of structures in our brains. You can find the globus pallidus in a monkey or in a rat, and so why, what's the special sauce that gives humans this extra power? We know we have bigger brains, but it's not just bigger brains, because there's other animals with very big brains, like killer whales and elephants. And so we want to sort of have two lectures on a possible sort of route to humans. And the first one is going to reach up toward vocal learning. I've got one little hair in front of here. Sooner or later, okay, got it. So one thing that I put here was the origin of language, not the evolution of language. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about came from thinking about another symbol-using system, because language is a symbol-using system, but there's another symbol-using system at a very low level, the molecular level, with DNA, RNA, and proteins. And if we think about that system, we think about the origin of the system, because it didn't evolve, because evolution, Darwinian evolution, wasn't possible until you had such a system. And so I think it might be better to think about the origin of language as the second coming of that kind of a symbol-using system, rather than thinking about it strictly from the point of view of how language evolved. We really want to think of how did another symbol-using system originate that gives you the possibility of evolution. That's the perspective that we're taking here. Now, we don't ignore evolution, because we're going to talk about vocal learning, the evolution of vocal learning, but it's also worthwhile thinking of it as sort of the origin of a new system from scratch, the way that you would think of the origin of life. Okay, so to start with, we have to sort of put ourselves into a basic evolutionary perspective of where we are relative to other primates and other animals, and what their abilities are in the case of, say, vocal learning or various language-like abilities. And so if we make a large cladogram here leading up, it's so not straight, leading up to birds, because we're going to talk about birds. So where do birds fit into this picture? So here's birds here. So birds are basically a branch off of dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs, here's they went extinct, as you know. So dinos over here. So you can see all evolution leads to birds. So this is a cladogram, sort of a diagram of the branching relations between species. So there's a lot of other things we could put on here, like reptiles, but we'll just leave them out and just talk about birds and primates. So if we go down to the very base here, what do primates lead to? Well, they lead to bonobos. Well, not just bonobos. You'll see that when we actually make these branching diagrams, you can flip the various leaves around. So we don't want to sort of think of evolution as just leading to humans. But I'll fill in some of these later. But let's start with early branches. And so there's a number of early branches of primates. And so one early branch goes to galagos. So galagos they're small nocturnal primates. that live in Africa. And they're sometimes called bush babies because they actually sound like a baby. They make these relatively bizarre sounding to somebody who's never heard one, sound that sounds like a little baby crying out in the bush. And so that's why they're actually called bush babies. So they're nocturnal, live at night. And there's lemurs. I left lemurs off, but let's put tarsiers, which are a little more closely related to other primates. That's another small nocturnal primate. So when you look at diagrams like this, one thing that's important is from the point of view of somebody classifying things, this is a good group right here. So this group is primates. So primates is a good group because we have all the branches. So sometimes these tarsiers and galagos, nocturnal primates, are called prosimians, which sort of, like before apes. But that's not a good group. That's a group that's not that doesn't grab all the branches of it. So primates grabs all the branches that came off primates. But this group is what we will call a paraphyletic group. It's just a group of animals that doesn't include, that you can't grab at the base and get all of the, and so it's not a good grouping. The reason that it's used is because they're both nocturnal and they're both small, and they both, live in Africa and Asia. But that's not a good premise to actually make an actual branching group of related animals. So that's why prosimians is in quotes. But if we look at animals that are a little more closely related to us, we have New World monkeys. And so why do we call them sort of New World versus Old World monkeys? New World monkeys. It's because plate tectonics, Africa was close to South America, and Europe was close to North America, but they separated with plate tectonics, starting like 60 million years ago. And so what happened was you ended up with parallel evolution in the New World and the Old World because they were just separated by an ocean that didn't used to be there before. So New World monkeys are basically in South America, Central America, and North America. And then Old World monkeys are in Africa and Asia. And they're a little bit slightly more closely related to us than New World monkeys. So these are Old World monkeys. So what are examples of some of these? So Old World monkeys, New World monkeys might be a cebus monkey, like an organ grinder monkey, or a spider monkey, or a squirrel monkey. Old World monkeys would be something like a macaque monkey, or a baboon, or a patis monkey. So then I'm going to get a little closer. The next closest branch are gibbons. And gibbons, they're very arboreal. They have some at the San Diego Zoo. They make some noise, but they don't have any vocal learning like birds do. So they make very characteristic sort of yelps. And then as we get closer and closer, we get orangutans. Orangs, sort of the old man of the forest. And then things get a little confusing. So the next branch off turns out to be gorillas. And so where are humans in this? Well, humans are the next branch off, right here, H. Humans. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of paleoanthropology. And so we know that there are several branches off of humans that went extinct, before humans. We'll talk a little bit about those. But then when we get to bonobos, it turns out here's where chimpanzees are common chimpanzees. They're called common chimpanzees. Now, when you do these kinds of diagrams of trying to figure out either using features or DNA, one of the things you'll notice is that one of the kinds of measures that people use is the idea of primitive versus derived features. Now, it's not really primitive in the sense of like, the way the connotations of the word primitive. It more has to do with whether something has changed or not. So let's take just chimpanzees, humans, and gorillas. Now, if you actually look at the branching pattern, what people thought for many years was that you had something like this. Like if you look at, so there's humans, and here's chimpanzees and gorillas. Everybody thought it was like that, like chimpanzees go with gorillas, and then chimpanzees plus gorillas go with humans. And why do they do that? Well, partly it's by not paying attention to this distinction between primitive and derived. So a primitive feature for all mammals is being hairy. So virtually all mammals are hairy. They were hairy before primates. So if you look at a gorilla and a chimpanzee, you look at them and you say, well, they're both hairy. They both sort of walk on their knuckles. Humans are upright. They don't have much body hair. But that's a primitive feature, hairy. And so hairy is actually not a good feature for grouping things because everybody's hairy. All I have to do is just stay hairy. Just don't change. So that's a primitive feature for primates, for all primates. And so when people started doing more careful molecular work and morphological work, it turns out that here's the branching pattern. So the branching pattern is that chimpanzees go with humans, and then chimpanzees plus humans go with gorillas. So basically chimpanzees just kept their original hairiness, and humans got rid of it. The fact that we got rid of it, that's a really good derived feature that's different. But there's a lot of other derived features that we can use, especially in the DNA, that show that chimpanzees are more closely related to humans than they are to gorillas, even though they look like gorillas. So don't get confused by sort of primitive versus derived, features. Okay, so now, but those are kind of way back there. Although a lot of the data that we have from the brain comes from old and New World monkeys, and to a lesser extent from galagos. There's almost no data from the brain from gibbons, orangs, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. And then, of course, there's a lot of data from humans. So unfortunately, the animals that are most closely related to us, we have almost no data. We have anatomical data, but we have almost no functional data or recording data. But now let's just look at sort of the human lineage here, which goes back to, maybe this branch point is maybe 6 to 8 million years ago. Right here, the branch point that leads to humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos. So let's just do that over on the right here. And so let's make a 0 up here, and then we'll go back to about 4 million years before present years. So there's a 0. That's the present. 4, 3, 2, 1. So this is, a million years. And then what we'll do is we'll take the last 0.1 million years, also known as 100,000 years. So take this guy and expand it out. So we'll expand this out here this last bit where a lot of stuff is going on. So this is 0 again, and then this is just 100,000. Okay, so if we go back to early branches off the human line, what we see is a group of animals that we could just call them early Australopithecines. Australopithecines just means southern ape, because they were found in Africa, Central and Southern Africa. And so we'll just call these guys Lucy, because there was a very complete skeleton of a female early Australopithecine that was found a number of years ago. And so these guys, we don't know exactly, where they came from, but other ones have been found since then. We don't know exactly when they died out or what the branching pattern is. The problem is you don't have enough fossils. We just have like a handful of fossils, and so species are constantly branching off and dying out, and sort of trying to figure out the exact branching pattern is quite challenging. But what were these guys like? So, what were their features? So when Lucy was discovered in the 80s, the late 70s, one of the things that was surprising was that this was a bipedal animal. It wasn't perfectly bipedal, but compared to a chimpanzee or a gorilla, it was basically standing upright. So it's a bipedal animal. It was very small, like maybe 50 pounds. Small, and it had an ape-sized brain. So it had the brain wasn't any bigger than a chimpanzee, about the size of a chimpanzee, which is roughly about a third the size of a human brain. And this was kind of a surprise, controversial at the time, because generally, when people are thinking about evolution, like I said at the very first lecture, there's certain sort of fixed ideas. And one of the fixed ideas is this idea that, humans dominate over other animals, whereas we have language and intelligence, and that must have driven our evolution. And so the idea is, we started off kind of leaning over, we got a big brain, and then we said, we should actually make something of ourselves. And then we sort of slowly became upright. And that sort of drove, we should get off the ground and pick up stuff and build things. But that's not the way it worked. The way it worked is you first got bipedal with an ape-sized brain. But what were these guys like? They're only like 50 pounds. They're probably like little miniature marathon runners. They're probably really good at running, because we know that these guys were eaten by large carnivores. There's actually a skull with two carnivore canine holes in it. So these guys were definitely eaten by carnivores. So they're really good runners. But if you just compare humans and assume that something like Lucy was similar, so compare humans to bonobos, to gorillas and bonobos and chimpanzees, what you find out is that humans have an incredible ability, incredible stamina compared to chimpanzees and gorillas. So there's something you can measure, like if you go on a treadmill and start running on a treadmill and huffing and puffing, you can measure how much oxygen can you use. Obviously, if you're in better shape, you're a cyclist or something, you can use more than somebody who is not in as good shape. But generally, humans have the ability to use a very large amount of oxygen, about 4 times. It's called VO2 max. So we can metabolize 4 times as much oxygen on a continuous basis compared to a chimpanzee. Now, chimpanzees and gorillas are really strong. And if you had to if you were in a fist fight with a chimpanzee, you're completely wiped out. They're so strong they could lift you up and just literally just toss you into the air, or could break one of your bones just with a blow. And when chimpanzees and humans interact, chimpanzees often think, well, they're probably like us, they're probably pretty strong. And then, what happens is they knock some human, the human goes tumbling over, and then they go, whoa, that guy's not as strong as I was expecting. So it's extremely dangerous to work with chimpanzees. They could literally just break your bones like toothpicks, or rip your face off, literally. So they're extremely strong, but they're not as good at long distance. Like humans have them, completely beat out of the park at long distance, and that's probably why we have no hair. So these guys are probably hairless. So why do we have no hair? It's because we have extremely good temperature control compared to apes. That's why we can have such a high VO2 max, is because we can control our body temperature. And so humans can run down game. Like obviously a deer can take off at high speed. Humans can't run as fast as the deer, but all you got to do is just keep chasing them. Eventually the deer collapses from exhaustion, hit him on the head. So humans, so they were probably like these weird little miniature marathon runners that are running across the plains. They still went up in the trees, so their fingers were relatively long. Not as long as gibbon, but relatively long, so they went up into the trees. So that's kind of where we came from. We don't know exactly what the relationship is to a series of animals that are sort of in this range here, but there was a series of another set of animals that had bigger brains. And these guys, and they're generally called, these are the standard Australopithecines, and so there were ones that were called gracile, like the gracile nucleus, meaning they're sort of light-bodied, and then there were ones that were called robust. And so these are also Australopithecines. So their brains were bigger, maybe getting up to like about half the size of a modern human, bigger than the original sort of Lucy ones. These robust ones had these gigantic teeth for grinding seeds, giant jaws and teeth. The gracile ones, they're more light-bodied, had relatively big teeth, but not as big as the robust ones. Okay, so again, we don't know exactly who led to who. But if you go a little bit later, we get to go up to like about 1 million. So we get to a group that's generally called early Homo, meaning early species Homo, so same species as us. And they're getting up to like, closer to 2/3 of the size of a modern human brain. And then a little bit later we have a long run for Homo erectus, and it's not clear exactly when they went extinct. There's some suggestion that it's possible that there was a dwarf Homo erectus So Homo erectus has brains, again, like about 2/3 the size, so considerably bigger than these guys. Gracile and robust is on the order of 1/3 to a half. These early Homo and Homo erectus are closer to 2/3. So it's possible that the dwarf Homo erectus might have survived. So these guys are Homo erectus. And so what kind of animals are these? Well, these guys made these very characteristic. So what kind of tools did these guys make? So these guys made these things called, Oldowan tools. And what those were just basically, you take a pebble and break it in half. Now you might think, it's not such a big deal, but it's better than a pebble that's not broken in half. So you break a pebble in half, maybe hit it a second time, and you get something that has a sharp edge that you can use as a tool. And you can see that these animals at this time were making, or these hominins at this time were making these. Homo erectus made these, very characteristic Acheulean hand axes, and these are like, like nice stone tools, what you think of as a stone tool. They're quite big. They're big, like I drew it at about the right size relative to my hand. Pretty big thing. And these took a lot of work, and they had a nice sharp edge on them with a nice sort of gripping part at the top here. So that's Acheulean hand axe. Now, when you look at that goes with these guys, and these Oldowan tools go with somebody in this range. So these are more sophisticated, but one thing to consider, like all over the world, there was Homo erectus that went to a lot of different parts of the world. They made the same kind of hand axes, and my joke is always, it's kind of like they discovered bell bottoms, and then they just wore bell bottoms for like 1.5 million years. And so they were very different from humans that way, that they were much more sort of fixed in their ideas. They made these hand axes all over different parts of the world, very similar hand axes, with not much variation in types of hand axes. So that's Homo erectus. Now, how did their brains get bigger? One of the problems with a big brain is you have to support it. And so when did fire come in? So, fire, we don't know exactly when fire, but, it's somewhere in this range. It's somewhere in this range when fire came in. And when you think of fire, you think of cooking a mammoth or something like that. That's not what you should think about what they were probably using it for. So what they're probably using it for was cooking root vegetables to make them more digestible. So if you look at primates, they're all vegan. So chimpanzees will occasionally, like I always say, they'll occasionally have a baby monkey for Christmas, but they're basically vegan. They eat fruits and nuts and leaves. Whenever they have a baby monkey, they never have it without salad. So they always get a bunch of leaves, put a bunch of leaves in there before they occasionally eat the baby monkey. But basically they're vegan, and they have a long vegan-like gut. They don't have no primates have an omnivore-like gut like a bear. Like a bear is an omnivore. It eats, meat as well as berries. So we basically have a vegan-like gut, but our gut is a little shorter than the guts of chimpanzees and gorillas. And how do we get that shorter gut? Probably by cooking vegetables. And so when we've actually started to look at what are the residues on the teeth, you find all different kinds of plant residues, and particularly like roots and tubers that have high carbohydrate content, but you can't easily digest them if you just eat a raw potato or a raw yam. And so they're basically using fire as a way to pre-process high-calorie vegetable foods so that they could make a bigger brain. And so that's probably what really boosted us up into the final size of our brain. Okay, so now, but there's probably still no modern language here, because these guys, making these same hand axes for 1.5 million years, that doesn't look very human. So if we go more recently, we have this group called Denisovans. They found a finger in a cave. I think it's about 60,000 years old, something like that, 70,000. I can't remember the exact dates. Don't quote me on that. And from that, they were actually able to sequence the DNA from this little finger. And they're closely related to Neanderthals. So you've probably heard of Neanderthals. Closely related to these guys. And we know that Neanderthals went extinct, but we also know that modern humans could have sex with them, because we have like about 5% Neanderthal. So we've been able to sequence Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, and so there's some Denisovan DNA in humans as well. And so we know, somewhere, it's not clear exactly how old these guys are, what the oldest one are, but back here is when we got modern humans. So these are, Homo sapiens. So those are modern humans. We don't know if we killed off the Neanderthals, or maybe we just reproduced slightly faster than the Neanderthals. All they'd have to do is just reproduce, like, say, generate, like, two kids every 5 years instead of 3 kids every 5 years, and do that for like 20,000 years, and you could overtake them. So we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that we made it through. So what's the last bit? Well, agriculture comes in very early, long before cities. So people were doing agriculture like 20,000 years ago, like 20,000 at least. And the big cities don't come in until 5,000. So now the question is, like, where is language in that? And so the first thing we want to do is let's go and look at what apes can do, the most closely related animals to us can do in terms of something that's like language. And when we do that, there's a couple interesting things that were discovered. So these were originally done with common chimpanzees, but then more recently these experiments have been done with bonobos. But let's just put our sort of ape, quote-unquote, language. So these experiments started off quite early in the 50s. They basically just got a baby chimpanzee, common chimpanzee, and raised them with a kid. This would not be allowed today, but they just brought a chimpanzee into the house and raised him with a kid. And the first thing to try to teach them language. And the first thing, they have terrible vocal learning. So they have no voluntary control over their vocalizations. They make vocalizations like, that's called a pant hoot, and a couple other like screeching noises, but they can't do it. They do it sort of under emotional conditions, but they can't sort of just say, make a sound like that. It's very hard for them. So what they did was they taught the early chimpanzees sign language. Now, it wasn't really sign language, because at the time, when they were first doing these experiments, humans didn't actually understand sign language. They didn't really understand that sign language is a full language. It hadn't really been completely understood how complex sign language. Certainly anybody who was deaf understood that sign language was a perfectly good language, but it's kind of in the general scientific community, it wasn't really well understood. And so they didn't even use fluent signers. But there's a number of apes you might have heard of, like Washoe and Sarah. And then there was the famous one, Nim Chimpsky, named after Noam Chomsky. That was Herbert Terrace had done that. And so they showed that they could teach the animals, like 20 to 50 different hand signs for objects. But the thing that completely sort of blew everything out of the water was Kanzi. And so Kanzi, I'll tell just a little bit more of the story of Kanzi. So Kanzi was a bonobo, not a common chimpanzee. So common chimpanzees are kind of more violent. Bonobos, have more sex. If there's some conflict, bonobos will have sex, whereas common chimpanzees would have like a big war. So that sort of seems, and their female genitalia are rotated around the front like humans. They have face-to-face sex, bonobos do, compared to common chimpanzees. But that's not particularly why they studied, and they just happened to have one around. And they were trying to teach Kanzi's mother, Panbanisha, who is a common chimpanzee, they were trying to teach her some symbols. And they had previously done experiments where they had a symbol board like this with a bunch of sort of arbitrary symbols on it, with up to 200 symbols on it. There were, little things like this, triangles, and they just kind of made up a not very good alphabet of about 200 of these, and they took common chimpanzees, and what they could do, an example of what chimpanzee could do is get two chimpanzees here. There was one called Sherman and Austin, and it was incredibly difficult to train these guys because they're a little tetchy and they're kind of running off all the time. But they managed to get them to do this game where one guy presses a symbol. So he reaches out and presses one of these symbol buttons, lights it up. And then this guy will look at a video monitor which has a camera in another room focused on a box of junk. And if one of those things, like say it's a doll or a banana, it could be a banana, not just attractive things like a banana, but also things like a doll. If that is the symbol for a doll, this guy looks at the video camera, see, is there a doll in the other room? If there is, go into the other room and get the doll and give it to this guy. So they managed to train animals to do that, and they could learn 50 different symbols and clearly call to mind a doll just from that symbol with no doll in the room. So that's the previous, you will put Sherman and Austin. But what they did with Kanzi, they were just trying to train Kanzi, not Kanzi, they were trying to train Kanzi's mother on this symbol board. And she was a bonobo, she was going very slow, and she got pregnant and had Kanzi. They weren't trying to train Kanzi, they were trying to train the mother. The mother, after 2 years of laborious training, had learned, I think, 2 symbols as an adult bonobo. They weren't paying any attention to Kanzi. Kanzi's just sitting there, and when they press one of these symbols to try to teach the chimpanzees these symbols, they would actually say the word, like they would press the symbol and say doll at the same time. So it turns out Kanzi, without being explicitly trained, learned all the symbols. But not only did he learn all the symbols, he learned the actual auditory words as well. And so they found, and it's kind of amazing that, given how much we know about plasticity and early development, that they didn't start off with baby chimpanzees. Nim Chimpsky was a baby, but they didn't give him any real fluent sign language input. Whereas Kanzi was a little bit more natural. They're constantly talking. So Kanzi picked this up. And so there's a whole series of very detailed experiments that Sue Savage-Rumbaugh has done to directly compare chimpanzee comprehension of speech to human baby comprehension of speech, to sort of stage, where is chimpanzee speech comprehension relative to babies, to human babies. And chimpanzees can comprehend speech about as well as a 3 to 4 year old human. It's just amazing. This research has been sort of forgotten in a way, I think, but it's quite amazing. And what are some of the experiments that they did to sort of verify this? Well, they have a swimming pool because chimpanzees like to hang out in the swimming pool. There's all this stuff around the swimming pool. And then there's a speaker here. There's a little speaker. And what happens is, and then there's some humans here that are watching what's going on. And the humans have headphones on so that they can't hear the speaker. And then a sentence comes out of the speaker. And then they assess what Kanzi does. So here's Kanzi right here. So very careful. And then they compare this directly to a human 3 or 4 year old, the experimenter's human 3 or 4 year old in the exact same situation. And they gave sentences. So Kanzi can, understand something like, Kanzi hit doll, or doll hit Kanzi. So if you say Kanzi hit doll, Kanzi will hammer on the doll. If you say, doll hit Kanzi, Kanzi will take the doll and sort of like hit the doll against himself as if the doll was doing it. So he can understand like reversible subject-object, but he can understand other anomalous prepositional clauses. Like he can understand a sentence like, this comes out of the speaker, put the grape in the swimming pool. And Kanzi will go over, find the grape, and toss it in the swimming pool. It doesn't make any sense, but he clearly understands basic syntax of simple, 5, 6 word sentences. He can understand something like a completely anomalous sentence like, knife the doll with the banana. So like a speaker just says, knife the doll with the banana. No cues of other kind. These guys have their headphones on, they watch what happens. Kanzi picks up a banana and makes like a cutting action against the doll. So it's So what's stopping them? Because they basically have the ability to understand auditory speech without any vocal learning at all. They can understand auditory speech. They can put together, they can learn like a couple hundred words. They can put words together and get some kind of meaning out of the composite of those words together, which are kind of, so it's weird. Like they have all these abilities and yet they don't have any sort of productive abilities. So it's kind of a weird thing. So like what's stopping them? So the big problem is they just got this stupid symbol board. They have no productive symbols because you have to carry a 200 symbol board around, and then Kanzi can point at something to sort of comment on, on something that's going on. But it's not like it doesn't have the sort of the immediacy of speech. So what are animals that actually have good vocal learning like humans? So if we look at vocal learning, there's basically 3 groups of animals that have vocal learning. So there's birds, and there's 22 families of birds, but only 3 of them have vocal learning. And the first are hummingbirds. If you've ever heard a hummingbird, they make these little sort of like buzzing sort of sounds. And those are learned. And then there's parrots, and we know that parrots are quite good at vocal learning. They can sort of copy humans. They're in the wild, they make sounds kind of like and you can form those sounds. The parrots can learn how to form those sounds into things that sound like human words quite well. And then there's songbirds. And so let's just talk about songbirds. And there's a bunch of different kinds of songbirds. And so what is a bird song? What is a bird song? So let's just draw out sort of like a typical bird song. So a typical bird song lasts a couple seconds. And if this is frequency going up like that, and that's time going over there, so maybe like, 2 seconds. Most people are not that familiar with birdsong, but birdsong are controlled by the syrinx, and the syrinx is controlled by the 12th nerve. And so if you look, so there's the syrinx instead of the larynx. Syrinx, which is controlled by something that controls the tongue. So it's a separate vocal generating device. It generates relatively pure tones, but if you look at a songbird, a song will sound something like, if I sing it at sort of human pitch, like do it, zit, 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 boo it, boo it. Sorry, boo it, boo it, boo it. So, and that will take place over about 2 seconds. And there's a funny terminology that they have, is they call this in the songbird literature a syllable. It's not it's like 3 syllables, but that's what they call it. So so this thing is called a syllable. It's not like a human syllable. And then this whole thing is a song. Now some little pea-brain birds have only 1 song, but some of them have like 300 songs. And if you listen early in the morning, you can hear these. They're, and sometimes you probably think it's more than 1 bird, but if you carefully listen to it, you can hear these individual songs coming out. And so how are these learned? Well, they're actually learned, and the way we know that is we can take a speaker and take a little hapless baby bird that fell into the hands of the experimenters. Here he is with his feet and tail, and just play some song to that baby bird, and then turn off the speaker. The baby bird hasn't made any noise. And then what will happen is a couple months later, you'll get some babbling. So they'll start to make sound, which will sound sort of song-like. And then what they'll do is, as they make the sounds, they'll compare it with their memory of the song that they heard, and then they'll home in on it. So what they're doing is they're actually remembering what the sound is supposed to sound like. They make a sound, it's not right, and they adapt their output to generate the right sound. And they'll make a crystallized song that is an extremely good copy of what they heard. And there's different dialects. Like if you look at birds from up in San Francisco, they kind of got this San Francisco dialect. If you look at birds from Santa Barbara, they got the Santa Barbara dialect. They'll generate, if you take a San Francisco bird baby and play it a Santa Barbara dialect, it'll generate the crystallized song of a Santa Barbara, even though genetically it's from a population in San Francisco. So they're learning fine little details, and they do. Birds are monogamous. Almost all birds are monogamous, and so they do this thing called duetting, which is quite cute. Now, it's not actually sort of duetting like humans do. The way it works is the male will sing, say, this part of the song, and then instantly, like within 20 milliseconds, the female will jump in and sing this part of the song, and then the male will sing this part of the song. So it sounds like a single bird to an unpracticed human. It sounds like a single bird singing a song, but it's actually these two, a mated pair, singing back and forth. And what is that for? Well, that's in order to advertise. So birdsong is sexually attractive to the opposite sex. And so what's going on there is you're basically advertising this guy is married, because you can hear there's a female singing along with him. And so he's off limits, not attractive. And so other birds can easily tell the difference between like a duetted song and an actual single male singing a song all by himself. So what caused this? So what caused this was we have a distinct, so when we talk about evolution, we talk about natural selection. Natural selection is if you have a slightly better wing, you do a little bit better and you survive and reproduce more than somebody with a not as good a wing, genetically specified not as good a wing. So that's natural selection, and that's how animals get all these different adaptations. Good eyes, better eye than somebody else. You have a slightly better hawk eye. Then you eat a few more rabbits and you end up reproducing more. But there's another thing that Darwin talked a lot about called sexual selection. And sexual selection is a different thing. Sexual selection is selection, meaning like who gets to reproduce, conditioned by things that either the male or the female liked on the female or the male. So, and a great example is like these giant antlers that deer have. You can imagine it's quite a pain in the butt carrying those giant bones sticking out of your head in the forest. You're running into the trees and everything like that. So why do they have long antlers? They have long antlers because the lady deer like long antlers, and they actually mated more with the ones with longer antlers. There's a ton of stuff like this. So if you look at a mandrill has like a blue nose and some little red decoration. What is that from? That's from lady mandrills liking that particular kind of berry mandrill. So this can happen in females as well. So if you look at a female chimpanzee, they have these sexual swellings that come up when the chimpanzee is in estrus on their chest and on their butt, and those are obviously preferred by males. They evolved because males mated more with the animals that had those secondary sexual features. Now, this can compete with natural selection because, if the antlers get too big, you get stuck in the brush, and then you get eaten by a wolf. So these can actually compete with each other. But it's a powerful second pathway, and that's what we think caused birdsong. So when we look at birdsong, we say, birdsong is plenty good enough for language. Plenty good enough for language. So how many sounds do we need? Like Hawaiian has maybe 15 sounds. There might be like 35, 40 sounds in English. Most languages are like 20, 30 in that range. A bird that has 300 separate songs easily has enough distinguishable, learnable, individual sounds, and they can generate them plenty fast enough, just as fast as we can generate speech. So it's plenty good enough for language, but it doesn't have any meaning, any specific meaning of the individual segments of this song. And what does have very specific meaning are calls. So calls, all animals have calls, even something like a turtle. So what is an example of a call? So if you take a chicken and you make a shadow of a hawk over it, it will give the aerial predator call. So it's a specific sound that it makes that other chickens understand. And they understand, like, get the hell out of the way, get under the brush, because there's like a aerial predator. Monkeys will make those kinds of sounds as well, an aerial predator song. They'll make a separate song for a separate sound for like a snake in the grass or snake, etc. Some predator in the grass, and then they have various affiliative calls. So these are not learned. These are genetically programmed. They're meaningful. They're definitely meaningful. You make that aerial predator call, and other monkeys know, oh, why? Take cover. Very meaningful. They refer to something out in the world. Now, what is the problem with this? Well, so this is a small set of meaningful vocalizations. And it's an evolutionary dead end. So they're very tightly tied to emotion, because if you make a bunch of aerial predator calls when there's no aerial predator, then the other guys are going to say, he's just like, calling wolf, and then somebody gets eaten. And so they're very tightly controlled in evolution to be tightly tied to emotion, to have a small number of them, like on the order of 5 or 10, and be extremely meaningful, tightly tied to emotion, and sort of unitary calls. And so basically, you can sort of think of that as the evolutionary dead end of vocalization, of sort of vocal learning. And so what happened so birds still have that. Birds still have that. So if you pinch a bird, it will make sort of a squawk. A bird can call out an aerial predator. A songbird can call out an aerial predator. But a song is different. Song is like ridiculously complicated compared to these things, but it's not meaningful in the same way. It means several things. So it means, it's a territorial thing, like get out of my territory. It's a sexual advertisement. We know, for instance, if you take a European starling, some of the European starlings, the males have these separate control of the two halves of the syrinx, and they'll do a one-man band. So they'll run they'll go with one syrinx, and then they'll put a little solo on top with the other syrinx. It turns out if you actually play songs like that, the more complex the song, the more likely the female starling will ovulate. So it's actually a direct sexual signal to the opposite sex. It's attractive, and it actually causes ovulation. The more complex sounds cause ovulation. But it doesn't have any meaning. It's way over the top. So why did it get so complicated? It got so complicated because the females and or the males liked it, not because it meant anything. And so this is a way to sort of get around the evolutionary dead end of calls. And so the suggestion is, if we go back, say here's 0, if we go back to 4 million years, maybe there was a long stretch where, sexual selection of speech-like sounds was occurring. because we know that there's a lot of changes in the larynx. Larynx has descended into the throat that were required that couldn't have occurred just in the last 100,000 years. Because if you look at humans, if you go back like about 50, 100,000 years, you say those are modern humans. If you look at the ones I had up between 100,000 and 0, they made much more complicated tools. They made things out of bones. They had clothes. They put flowers in their grave site. You know, they're modern humans. They had some. They clearly had something like modern language. Culturally, they were incredibly more complicated than something. If you go back to like Homo erectus or the Australopithecines. And so we know that language was, by 50,000 years, we know there had to be basically modern language. But 50,000 years is not enough time to do all that stuff in the throat. And so the suggestion is there's a long stretch of vocal learning development which has to do with just liking the sound of speech. That doesn't mean anything. That's the critical thing, because these guys mean something. Aerial predator call means something. So what we needed to do is develop, just because people liked the way it sounded, a whole series of different sounds and all the neural control needed to actually learn them and produce them for reasons that have nothing to do with meaning, except this very general sort of sexual advertisement, territorial defense kind of meaning. And when you first hear this theory, it seems like, wow, that doesn't make too much sense. It's just like people were just making speech-like sounds with nothing to say. That's basically the theory. That's what birds do. They make speech-like sounds. They've completely rewired their whole vocal learning system to be able to generate and hear these and hone them, make them very specific, culturally specific, can learn from other birds that they're hearing with no meaning. And so the idea was that's how we booted the system. That's how we got around this evolutionary dead end of calls. We generated something that's like song, that doesn't have any meaning, but it's really complicated and it's really hard to produce, and you have to sort of like change the tongue and then innervation of the tongue and connect it up to the cortex in a different way, all that stuff, just because we liked the way it sounded. And then maybe at the last minute, we essentially plugged it into another system for meaning assembly, and I'll talk about that on next Friday. But that's the idea. When you first hear this, you say that can't be true, but we have several examples. So we have songbirds, and then we have another example in whales, just some whales. And they do the same thing. Their songs are slower, but they're learned. They're learned from genetically unrelated whales, and they're produced extremely precisely, just the way songbirds are, except they're slower because they're more echoey down under the water. So we have another case, and they have the same thing. They're territorial and they're sexual advertisements. And so we at least have another example, and then we have humans. And so the idea is that might be how we sort of bootstrapped the vocal learning part of language, as opposed to the idea that I want to mean something, and so therefore I have to control my articulators. Instead, let's just build up the articulators, just babbling stuff that people like the way it sounds, and then attach that up to a meaning system. So I think I just made it under the wire, Stan, so end there.